The real total package Mean Gene is right here, but his name is Buff, and he is the stuff. Look at me. I've got the arms, the shoulders, I've even got the cool tattoo. I am Buff.
July 2nd, 2001, the night that WCW had a main event on WWF Raw. This match was Booker T versus Buff Bagwell. The WWE will tell you that this entire match would be the sole reason that the WCW Invasion storyline changed its plans forever. All the blame of this match being bad would be put on the shoulders of Buff Bagwell. Before the WWF, Bagwell was a staple of WCW. He really broke out with the NWO. He had the look, he had the charisma, and he was an upper mid-card star in the company. Buff Bagwell was definitely a player in the Monday Night War. When WCW was bought out by the WWF, everyone on the roster had a chance. Would they keep their contracts with WCW and that guaranteed money? Or would they take a chance and go with the WWF and try and make it big? Buff Bagwell took a huge risk and went to the WWF, a risk that ultimately didn't pay off for him. WCW was doomed from out of the gate. Even before we look at the terrible match, and no, I don't think the match was that bad, we need to see how the WWF set them up for failure right out of the gate. WWF vs. WCW is the biggest war in pro wrestling history. Both the World Wrestling Federation and World Championship Wrestling would take shots at each other and say the other company sucked. WWF did a great job at making WCW look like a villain. When I say a villain, I'm not talking in the terms of wrestling heel, I'm talking real life. WCW is viewed as an awful company, and WWE to this day will tell you that WCW sucked. It always sucked, and it will forever suck. This was not the case, but that's the narrative that the WWE will tell. WWF Raw on July 2nd, 2001 was from Tacoma, Washington. This would not be a WCW friendly crowd. The next week's show was from Atlanta, Georgia, a place that was a WCW staple. Instead of waiting to the Booker T versus Buff Bagwell match in Atlanta, they chose to do it that night. This was a terrible idea. They were doomed from the start. They main evented WCW at the end of Raw, and the live crowd hated it. They booed Buff Bagwell. They booed Booker T. They booed Arn Anderson, and they even booed Stacy Keibler. There was nothing that Buff and Booker could do to get the crowd on their side. Buff Bagwell also states that before the match, Shane McMahon told the WCW guys not to talk directly to the camera. In the WWF, they don't do that here. Buff Bagwell's whole persona was him being full of himself and talking directly into the camera. It worked for him in WCW, and it would have worked for him here in WWF because he would be one of the only people doing it. Buff says that he was nervously avoiding looking at the camera, something that probably hurt him overall when it came to the end. Before Buff and Booker had their match, WWE brought the WCW guys in to run the ropes and learn the WWE ring in a training facility. During this, Buff got into an altercation with Shane Helms. Buff claims that Shane Helms threw a frozen water bottle at him and cracked his skull open. He says that Shane Helms was crying and he was saying sorry. Buff was told by wrestlers to say that he fell so that Shane Helms wouldn't get heat. So he told Finlay and John Laurinaitis that he slipped, fell, and hurt his head. He says he used his own insurance and money to get it fixed to keep the heat down. At TV, Shane Helms and the Hardy Boys walked by Buff Bagwell and didn't say anything to him. This made Buff Bagwell very angry. He went on to tell Laurinaitis what really happened, that Shane Helms threw a water bottle at him. They all had the WCW guys settle their differences. After the incident, Shane Helms had this to say: "When I got to WWE TV next week, the APA took my bags and put them on the WWE side. The locker room was really segregated in those days. WWE on one side and WCW on the other." Shane Helms also said that Steve Austin went and gave him a pat on the back. Once the match with Booker T happened, the match was bad. Now, I don't think the match was the worst match of all time, but the setting and the crowd reaction didn't help. Booker T and Buff Bagwell had many great matches in WCW, but this match just wasn't that great. The night was also not the night to do the match. They should have waited a week later in Atlanta, Georgia. The match would happen until Stone Cold and Kurt Angle came down to the ring and beat up Booker T. Buff Bagwell would join in on the attack until he was thrown out of the building himself. That would be the very last time that we saw Buff Bagwell in the WWE. Buff Bagwell goes on to say that WWF took the blame for that night. WWF would say that nobody in management talked to them to set up the match. Jim Ross then called him and said to take a weekend off and that let your head heal and that you'd be used in Atlanta next Monday. Then the story came out about his mom calling him. The story was that Buff Bagwell had his mom call into WWF to tell them that he couldn't work the weekend loop because of a head injury. Buff Bagwell claims that that's completely false. He shows up to the building in Atlanta and he was fired. Buff pretty much implies that WWF and Jim Ross were setting him up to fail and that Jim Ross never liked him. Jim Ross goes on to claim that he didn't sabotage Buff Bagwell's career. To me, the entire WWF versus WCW Invasion storyline never worked. They had to have many WWF guys side on WCW just to make the thing work. Buff Bagwell is a great wrestler with an unforgettable persona, but he was doomed from the very beginning. They had big plans for WWF Raw to turn into WCW Nitro, and SmackDown would be the WWF show, but after this match, they changed everything. It makes me believe that Vince McMahon never really wanted WCW to come in and flourish, and they still constantly talk bad about WCW to this day. WCW was never going to work in the WWF, but to say that this one match between Booker T and Buff Bagwell was the reason why is a complete lie. Buff Bagwell is not to blame for the WCW Invasion not working the way that they wanted.